Hello, Amber here and welcome to my knitting studio. Today I have an introduction to lace knitting video tutorial for you, and I hope to help you feel more confident in tackling what is one of my favourite techniques. In the video I'll cover looking at the chart and how to read a knitting lace chart, also lifelines, how to use them, and I'll talk a bit about stitch markers and some other tips. I hope this is helpful and will get you started with lace knitting. Lace knitting may seem a little daunting to a newer knitter or someone who hasn't tried it before, but like any new technique, you'll make mistakes along the way as you learn, but also the results are so beautiful and satisfying, it's worth the effort. If you're newer to lace, or I think generally even when you start a project, if there's a lot of stitches on the needles, it's quite helpful to knit a smaller swatch beforehand so that you can have a good understanding of how the pattern looks. And then you can keep that on hand too when you're knitting your larger project, just to check in and see if your stitches are lining up the way they're meant to. It really helps you to familiarise yourself with the pattern. Some sections in your lace knitting might be a bit trickier to read, so it's good to have something to refer back to. I also find the visual aspect of the chart helpful too when knitting lace, so you can see how things are supposed to look as you're knitting. In today's introduction to lace knitting, I'll knit up this swatch with you and just talk to you about a few things along the way so that you can see how it works. To begin, you'll need your instructions, your pattern instructions. Patterns will usually come with a chart for lace and also most commonly written instructions as well. So you can choose between the chart, the visual instruction, or the written instructions. And I know people generally have a preference either way. I know I prefer to use a chart and others really prefer to work from written instructions, and either is fine. I think it's good to have both on hand if they're both available, because it can help you, for example, if you're reading the written instructions, to refer to the chart just to see visually how things are supposed to look, or to perhaps gain a clearer understanding of how those instructions are working. So I think it's good to have both on hand, even if you prefer one or the other. I'm going to work from the chart today and talk a bit about knitting from the chart. Generally, the chart will look something like this. You'll see the chart, the key, the stitches are abbreviated in the key, and then the abbreviations are explained elsewhere in the pattern. So you can go there and, for example, look up the CDD and find that it's a central double decrease stitch, and there'll be an instruction how to work that stitch. You may still need more instruction if you're really unfamiliar with a stitch, and that's where Google is definitely your best friend. If you Google central double decrease, you'll find plenty of resources, videos, photo tutorials to help you learn that stitch. At the top here, there's the lace chart instructions, and this is relevant because on this particular chart, the wrong side rows, the even number rows, aren't shown. So there is a separate instruction. Every wrong side row is knit the same in this particular pattern. So the instruction is there. There's also a little tip about using markers, and I'll talk about that a bit later on when I show you the markers. As I said, this chart only shows the right side rows, and they're numbered along this side. If there were wrong side rows, they would be numbered along this side. So you would see row 2, row 4, row 6. And the way that you read the chart is by, on the right side rows, you'll go from the number and read from right to left as you knit. Then you'll turn your work and be working the wrong side row and either follow the instruction given, or if you're working from the chart, you'll work across from left to right. So you'll knit and read across this way, back to the next row, which will be a right side row. Here we have a repeat, which is this box here. For a swatch, you would ignore the repeat, you just knit across. But when you're working on a larger project with more stitches, you'll need to work this section the number of times required for the pattern. It may be twice, it may be 10 times. And it's usually quite helpful to put a stitch marker at the start and end of each repeat to keep you on track. So you would knit to the first marker, knit across that. Once you get to the next marker and the next lot of stitches to repeat, you come back to the start of that section and knit back across again, the number of times required. And then when you get to the last number of stitches, you'll just knit across those final stitches. So another stitch that you might come across in a chart is this one, which I have just realised is not represented in the key. I will need to amend that. So normally there would be a little grey square there with no stitch. And that's what this is, no stitch. You don't work it, you don't do anything there. It's just a placeholder to keep the chart aligned. If I didn't have those there, then the chart would be slightly skewed and you wouldn't see that clear representation of the pattern and how it's going to look once it's knit. For example, this line here corresponds to this line down here. So when you come to a no stitch in a knitting pattern, just ignore it. It's literally no stitch. At some point that pattern, this particular pattern, shifts over by a stitch and you'll see that that no stitch also shifts over. So it's just to keep it visually clear. In the written instructions, there won't be the no stitch mentioned. It's just not a stitch. So it's just a placeholder for the chart. There are a few different ways to use your chart instruction. You may prefer to work from a digital PDF file and you can use it on your iPad or device. There's a few apps that you can load these charts into that will give you an ability to make notes and move a marker up and down to help you keep track of where you're at. There's Knit Companion or the Books app on iDevices or Good Reader. They're all different formats that you might be able to put your PDF file into and use. I have this magnetic folder, which I really like to use. So it has strong magnets holding the chart in place and then this kind of magnetic slider that I can move up as I knit each row. And I work this way, knit up and then work the row just below the slider. And then this helps me, for example, when I'm up here, to maintain the visual view of what my knitted work will look like at that point. You can also use tape, reusable tape, to mark a paper chart. So there's a few different options there for how to work from your chart. Let's get swatching. So for this swatch, we're just going to cast on the number of stitches represented along the bottom row here. This may be completely different to the pattern. The pattern may say cast on 50 stitches or 300 stitches, whatever it is that the pattern says you'll cast on when you're knitting the pattern. For the swatch, you'll just be knitting this section to get a feel for it. Perhaps you want to check your gauge as well, so you can use it as a gauge swatch. If you're knitting a gauge swatch, you may want to make it bigger. You may want to add in an extra repeat of stitches. It's really up to you. So to get started, you'll count the number of stitches on that bottom row. You'll need 1, the yarn over isn't a stitch, so you don't count that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 stitches on this side, and then the number of stitches in the repeat, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. You may want to add multiples of 10. The pattern will be the edge stitches plus multiples of 10 as well. So if you're wanting to adjust a pattern, that's how you adjust it as well. And then this side we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13 stitches. So 13 plus 10 plus 5 is 28 stitches to cast on for this swatch. Okay, so I've cast on 28 stitches and knit back across, so I've got a little garter ridge for my swatch first row. I've knit this first section, the right edge, and I'm ready to place my first marker to mark the first repeat. And then I'll knit across 10 stitches and place the next marker and finish the row. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Again, if I had more stitches, multiples of 10 for the larger project, I would continue to knit 10 and place a marker until I get to these last 13 stitches and then knit across those. Okay, I'm up to row 5. I've knit a couple more rows and just going to stop here to work the next stitch and talk about stitch markers. So the next stitch on row 5, it actually states here, you will need to move the stitch marker, if you're using stitch markers, to work the slip slip knit on rows 5 and 9. So row 5, this slip slip knit just after the marker repeat, I'll need to move the stitch marker. And what that means is that I'm going to use one stitch from outside the repeat to work that stitch. And this is why I like to use these little closed stitch markers, because I can just lift that stitch back over to that side of the marker and then work the stitch. So the last stitch for this is yarn over, then the next stitch is slip, slip, knit. That's that there. Then I'll do another slip, slip, knit for the pattern after yarn over. So it's good to note where the stitches may jump or shift across the knitting in the repeats and help you keep track with your stitch markers. So that's why I like these little closed ones, which I buy in bulk. They're just jewellery findings, closed jump rings. The dangly stitch markers are very cute, but it's harder to slip a stitch over a dangly stitch marker. You'll need to slip the stitch across, take the stitch marker off, slip the stitch back over to work it and replace the stitch marker. So it's a little bit more of a process. However, the good thing about the dangly stitch markers is that when you're knitting lace with lots of yarn overs, those yarn overs can kind of jump over your stitch marker and shift the pattern repeat a little bit if you're not careful. And these dangly stitch markers actually avoid that from happening because the stitch just can't quite jump over that dangly marker. So there's pros and cons for each kind of stitch marker. It's really a personal preference thing, but either way, they'll help you keep track of your knitting. Once you've knit a few rows, and particularly if you have many stitches on the needles, you may want to place a lifeline in your work. And a lifeline is a line threaded through the loops of the knitting and then left with the ends dangling. You continue to knit ahead, leaving the line in place, and it gives you a kind of safe place to rip back to. If you find further ahead that you made a mistake and you want to rip your work back, you can comfortably rip back to that lifeline and all the stitches will be held in place while you then thread your needle back through the stitches. So it can be particularly handy for a newer knitter, just to give you that confidence to knit on and know that you can rip back easily. But yeah, knitters of all abilities can certainly use a lifeline. It's not just for beginners, particularly when you have a lot of stitches on the needles. It makes it a lot easier to rip back. There's two main ways that I'll show you to insert a lifeline. One of those is using some waste yarn and a tapestry needle, and you'll just thread that yarn through the needle and work your way across the stitches, threading one loop at a time onto the needle and pulling that yarn through. When you get to the stitch marker, it's best at this point to add a fresh stitch marker just to the lifeline, and that way you'll keep your repeats marked. You don't have to include a stitch marker, you can leave it, but you don't want to thread your lifeline through the stitch marker that you're using, because that marker will be carried up with your work. If you trap it with your lifeline, then you'll kind of trap that stitch marker into your knitting. So you don't want to do that. You want to keep that stitch marker either on the needle or on that lifeline, not both. So I'll skip that there. I've put a fresh one on the lifeline, and I'll continue to thread through again until I come to the next stitch marker, which I won't thread through. I'll pull, place another marker on my needles, on my lifeline, skip that stitch marker that's on the work, and thread through to the end. Pull that through and off the needle. So now I have these ends dangling, and I'll continue to knit, and I'll be careful not to knit into that waste yarn. It's good to have it quite a different colour so that you can see it clearly. So my next row is purling back across. I'll just purl back across the live stitches using that stitch marker and leaving the lifeline stitch marker in its place. So there's the lifeline in my work, marking that spot, holding those stitches in place. If I need to rip my work out, I can easily go back to that point and it won't rip out further anywhere below the lifeline. I'll continue to knit, and maybe I'll knit another 10 rows, 20 rows, doesn't really matter, and then put in another lifeline and just pull this one out when I'm putting in the next one. I'll show you how to use floss and your needles to insert a lifeline too. Some knitting needles come with a handy little hole. It might be for tightening the needles, and in some cases it's for adding a lifeline to your knitting. So in this case, I'm going to use some very thin floss and thread it through this hole, which is tricky, I have to admit. There we go. So with this technique, it's really simple because you carry that yarn along as you knit. So I'm putting it through the needle that I'm going to be knitting my stitches onto. I'll knit across the next row, and then I'll pull this thread through my live stitches. Okay, I've knit across that row, row 7, and have my lifeline thread attached to the needle here, and as I pull that needle through those stitches, I also pull that lifeline through. Then I'll just take it out of the hole in the needle, cut the end off, and I have a fresh lifeline through my needles, through my stitches. So the lifeline below, this green one, I don't need anymore. I have a fresh one in place. So I'll just pull this one out and allow those stitch markers just to drop out. I don't need that in place anymore. Now I have this fresh lifeline. However, with this method, the lifeline has pulled through the stitch markers. So I need to remember on my next row, when I knit back across, to drop these markers onto the lifeline and put fresh markers into my knitting so that the markers don't get trapped into the knitting. So I will carefully knit back across, being careful not to knit the thread into my knitting. Here I am at the place with the stitch marker. You can see that it's attached to the lifeline and on my needle. So what I'm going to do is just drop that so that it dangles with the lifeline and isn't incorporated into my knitting, and just put a fresh marker in to mark my place, my repeat, and continue until I get to the next marker, and I'll do the same there. And here we are, fresh lifeline in place, markers in place. As mentioned, you don't have to place markers in the lifelines, it's optional. And fresh markers in the knitting. So I can continue to knit, secure in the knowledge that I can easily rip back to this stage of my knitting and continue if I make a mistake. One of the most common lace knitting mistakes, I think, is dropping a yarn over and not noticing. So if you find that you've dropped a yarn over, I think that's one of the easiest things to fix as well. You just pick it up when you come back across. So I think that is a pretty common mistake to make. So if you notice that something's not lining up, you don't have the hole where it's supposed to be, that might be what's happened. And sometimes if I'm looking at my work and I think, oh, I missed something here, perhaps I dropped a yarn over or something, I'll use these removable stitch markers and I'll just mark a spot where I notice something. So when I'm knitting back across, I have a little reminder that I need to correct something or fix something there, just a little reminder. As you get more confident with knitting lace, you might notice other mistakes like a missed decrease or something, and that you can just rip down a few little stitches, columns of stitches, and fix a mistake like that. That's just something that comes with confidence, which comes with practice, and the more you do, the more confident you'll become, and the more you'll be able to fix little mistakes. Sometimes you just need to rip back and get started again and get yourself back on track. And well, it's frustrating. It's just part of the process of learning, and the outcome is worth it. I always say I never regret ripping back. It's always so annoying and frustrating, but when I rip back and redo my work, then I'm happier with the outcome, and that's satisfying to me. It makes it worth it, that bit of extra time. So that's it, introductory to lace knitting. I hope that gives you some confidence to hopefully try some more complicated lace knitting, or even give it your first try. Thanks for watching.